The stage lights felt like interrogation lamps, and the crowd's roar sounded like a jury delivering a guilty verdict. Kurt gripped his guitar neck so tightly his knuckles went white, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. 3 songs into the set at the Paramount Theatre, and everything was wrong. The amp was feeding back at frequencies that made his teeth ache. Dave's drums sounded like they were coming from underwater, and the audience, Christ, the audience looked like a sea of expectations he could never meet. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not tonight. Not at a venue this important, with critics in the front row and label executives lurking in the VIP section, like vultures waiting for something to die. But Kurt could feel it building, that familiar tightness in his chest, like someone was slowly turning a vice around his ribcage. His vision started to tunnel, the crowd becoming a blur of faces that all seemed to be judging him, finding him wanting, waiting for him to fail in spectacular fashion. He tried to push through it. That's what you did as a performer. You pushed through the fear, the doubt, the voice in your head that said you were a fraud who didn't deserve to be on this stage. But as they launched into Come As You Are, Kurt felt something snap inside his chest. The words wouldn't come. He opened his mouth to sing the first verse, but nothing emerged except a strangled sound that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a scream. The guitar felt impossibly heavy in his hands, like it was made of lead instead of wood and steel. Dave and Chris kept playing, assuming he was just having a momentary equipment problem, or maybe building dramatic tension. But Kurt could see the confusion creeping into their expressions as the verse section came and went without vocals. The crowd started to murmur, not booing yet, but the restless stirring of people who sensed something was off. Kurt could hear individual voices cutting through the general noise. What's wrong with him? Is his mic working? This is weird. That's when the panic really hit. Kurt stumbled backward from the microphone stand, nearly tripping over the monitor cables. His heart was beating so fast it felt like it might burst through his ribcage. The stage lights seemed to be getting brighter, hotter, pressing down on him like the weight of every expectation he'd never been able to meet. He looked out at the audience, 2,000 people who'd paid money to see him perform, who'd come here expecting magic or catharsis or at least competent rock music. Instead, they were getting front-row seats to a complete mental breakdown. Dave finally stopped playing, his drumsticks hanging suspended over the kit as he stared at Kurt with growing alarm. Chris had already put down his bass and was taking a step toward the front of the stage. "Kurt!" Chris's voice came through the monitor speakers, amplified for the entire venue to hear. "You okay, man?" Kurt tried to answer, tried to say something that would explain what was happening, that would turn this disaster into something manageable. But when he opened his mouth, the only sound that came out was a choked gasp that got picked up by his vocal mic and broadcast through the PA system. The crowd's murmur turned into something else, concern mixed with confusion, and underneath it all, the first hints of disappointment. Kurt could feel their energy shifting, could sense them starting to turn from supportive audience into critical observers of his failure. That's when he made the decision that would define the rest of the night. Without a word to his bandmates, without any announcement to the crowd, Kurt pulled off his guitar strap and let his instrument drop to the stage floor with a discordant crash that echoed through the suddenly quiet venue. Then he turned and walked straight toward the side stage exit, leaving behind 2,000 people and a half-finished song and the weight of expectations he could no longer carry. The backstage area erupted in chaos the moment Kurt disappeared into the wings. What the fuck just happened? The tour manager was immediately on his radio, trying to figure out how to handle a situation that had no precedent in his experience. Is he sick? The venue's production coordinator was already calculating the logistics of refunding tickets and dealing with an angry crowd. Did he say anything to you guys about feeling bad? The label representative looked like he was about to have his own panic attack, probably calculating the financial implications of a canceled show. But Kurt heard none of this. He was moving on autopilot, muscle memory guiding him through the maze of equipment cases and catering tables and crew members who all stopped to stare as he stumbled past. His only goal was to get as far away from the stage as possible, to put distance between himself and the sound of 2,000 people realizing that their evening had just taken an unexpected turn. He found himself in a loading dock behind the venue, gulping October air that tasted like car exhaust and autumn leaves. The concrete beneath his feet was solid and real in a way that the stage had stopped being. Out here, away from the lights and the crowd and the crushing weight of performance, he could almost breathe again. Kurt sat down on a loading dock bumper and put his head in his hands. From inside the venue, he could hear the muffled sound of confusion. People talking, shouting, the general noise of a crowd that didn't know what to do with itself. Someone was making an announcement over the PA system, but he couldn't make out the words. There you are. Kurt looked up to see a woman approaching from the direction of the venue's back entrance. She was maybe 35, with short dark hair and the kind of clothes that suggested she worked in the music industry but wasn't trying to be part of the scene. A press badge hung from a lanyard around her neck. I'm Sarah Martinez from Rolling Stone, she said, stopping a few feet away from where Kurt sat. I was backstage when you left the stage. Kurt's stomach dropped. A reporter. The last thing he needed was for this moment of complete professional breakdown to end up documented in a major music magazine. Look, he said, his voice still shaky. I know this looks bad. I know this is probably great copy for you. Nirvana's Kurt Cobain has on-stage meltdown or whatever. But I'm asking you, as one human being to another, please don't write about this. Not tonight. Sarah studied his face in the dim light from the loading dock's security lamp. Actually, I wasn't planning to write about it. At least, not the way you're probably thinking. What do you mean? Sarah sat down on the concrete steps leading up to the loading dock, maintaining a respectful distance but positioning herself so they could talk easily. I mean, I've been covering music for 15 years, and I've seen this happen before. Maybe not exactly like this, but the pressure gets to people, especially people who didn't ask to become the voice of a generation. Kurt let out a bitter laugh. Voice of a generation. Jesus. I can barely be the voice of my own thoughts most days. That's exactly what I mean, Sarah said. Do you know how many musicians I've interviewed who've told me they feel like frauds? Like they're one performance away from being exposed as someone who doesn't belong on stage? Most of them probably don't prove it by walking off in the middle of a song. No, but most of them don't have the courage to admit when they're overwhelmed either. They just keep pushing through until something breaks. Their voice, their relationships, their sanity, sometimes their lives. Kurt looked at Sarah more carefully. There was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't just talking academically about the pressures of fame. You sound like you speak from experience, he said. Sarah nodded. I spent 5 years documenting the Seattle music scene before it exploded. I watched a lot of really talented people get chewed up by an industry that cares more about profit margins than human beings. and I watched a few people who were smart enough to walk away before the machine destroyed them. Walking away from a show isn't exactly smart. It's professional suicide. Is it? Or is it self-preservation? Kurt considered this. From inside the venue, he could still hear the sounds of confusion and disappointment. His bandmates were probably fielding questions they couldn't answer. The label executives were probably having emergency meetings about damage control. The fans were probably feeling cheated and confused. "I don't know what happened in there," Kurt said finally. "I've played hundreds of shows, some of them in venues way smaller and way more intimidating than this one. But tonight I got up there and it was like I forgot how to be a performer. Like I suddenly saw myself from the outside and realized I had no idea what I was doing." "Maybe that's not a bad thing," Sarah said. "Maybe that's growth." "Growth? I just humiliated myself in front of 2,000 people and probably destroyed my band's reputation. How is that growth?" Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Can I tell you something? About 6 months ago, I was supposed to interview Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam. Big cover story, lots of pressure from my editor to get something revelatory. But when I got to the studio where they were recording, Eddie was sitting outside in the parking lot crying." Kurt listened, intrigued despite himself. "He told me that he'd been in there for 3 hours trying to nail a vocal track, and every take sounded fake to him. He said he felt like he was becoming a parody of himself, just going through the motions of being Eddie Vedder the rock star, instead of actually creating something real." "What did you do?" "I put away my notebook and recorder, and we just talked. About music, about pressure, about what it means to try to stay authentic when thousands of people are watching your every move. We never did the formal interview. But that conversation, that honest, unguarded conversation, taught me more about what it means to be an artist than any quote I could have printed." Kurt felt something loosen slightly in his chest. "So, what you're saying is, I'm not the first person to crack under this kind of pressure." "You're not even the first person to crack under this kind of pressure this week," Sarah said with a slight smile. "The music industry has a way of taking sensitive, creative people and putting them in situations that are designed to break them. The remarkable thing isn't that you walked off that stage. The remarkable thing is that you recognized when you needed to step away." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, listening to the distant sounds of the venue dealing with the aftermath of Kurt's exit. Eventually, Sarah stood up. "I should probably head back in there," she said. "See if your bandmates need someone to talk to who understands what just happened." "Wait," Kurt said. "You said you weren't going to write about this the way I was thinking. What did you mean?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. "I think there's a story here about the cost of authenticity in an industry that rewards performance over truth. About what happens when someone who makes honest music suddenly feels like they can't be honest anymore. But that's not a story about you having a breakdown. That's a story about an artist choosing vulnerability over invincibility." Kurt felt tears prick at his eyes. For months, he'd felt like he was drowning in other people's expectations, in the pressure to be the Kurt Cobain that existed in magazines and music videos, rather than the confused, anxious person he actually was. "Would you want to do that interview?" he asked. "Not tonight, obviously. But sometime when I can actually string together coherent sentences." Sarah smiled. "I'd be honored, but only if you promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you'll remember that what happened tonight wasn't a failure. It was a choice. And sometimes making the choice to step away from something that's hurting you is the bravest thing you can do." Kurt nodded. feeling something like relief wash over him for the first time in hours. "There's something else," Sarah said, as she prepared to leave. "Your bandmates have been taking turns coming out here looking for you. They're not angry. They're worried. And there are about 50 people from the crew who've been asking if there's anything they